Welcome to Traveling Culturati, where we explore cultures and share travel news, travel tips, destinations, and travel chats. Visit travelingculturati.com for more information.
Well, hey there, fellow Culturati. Javon Harley here, your host and travel pro for Traveling Culturati. The website, travelingculturati.com. Make sure you go ahead and check it out and join the travel club. Yeah, we're going to some fantastic places for 2026. Egypt coming up May 2nd through the 12th. Going to Cairo, a Nile River cruise, going to Abu Simbel. It's going to be a fantastic cultural and historical experience. You don't want to miss it. France, May 16th through the 23rd. Some of my favorite places, Bordeaux, Cognac, Cité du Vin, Josephine Baker's estate, and of course we're going to Champagne and Paris. Yes, gay Paris. Looking forward to that. Coming up in June 2nd through the 13th, Fiji, a 4-night Fiji Island cruise, and a couple of nights on the main island of Nadi. That's always a wonderful experience. Visiting our Melanesian cousins across the Pacific Ocean. And Portugal coming up September 6th through the 13th, visiting Lisbon, Porto, and guess what? It is harvest season at that time in Portugal, and there's going to be plenty of wine and experiences there. And then Thailand, October 25th through November 3rd. So you don't want to miss any of them, but maybe you can just pick one or two that you want to go on and join us. Again, the website is travelingculturati.com. Well, 2026 marks the 100th anniversary of Negro History Week and 50 years of Black History Month, ensuring that Black history would be included in education. The centennial highlights 100 years of resilience, economic empowerment, and cultural impact. Sad to say that Black History Month is coming to an end, but of course, Black history is 365. But February, we celebrate and pay homage, and here at Traveling Culturati, we highlight the history, sites, trails, and of course, the culture. Today, we're chatting with award-winning journalist, cultural critic, and author of the U.S. Civil Rights Trail, Deborah Douglas. And then we're traveling to Washington, D.C. with Kenny Burns. But first, I've got some travel news. There's some safety concerns in Mexico. And so the question is, should tourists worry about recent cartel violence? So recent cartel violence in western Mexico has worried travelers, but officials report tourist areas are open. Some flights and roads in Jalisco were disrupted, though conditions are improving. Experts advise visitors to follow official guidance, remain flexible, and to check information carefully due to social media misinformation. Mexican security forces killed a major cartel leader, leading to retaliatory roadblocks, vehicle arson, and transport disruptions in Jalisco and Michoacan. International travelers experienced delays and cancellations in Puerto Vallarta and Guadalajara during the unrest, with some visitors briefly stranded as airlines adjusted schedules. Most tourism infrastructure is now operating normally. Airports resumed regular flights by Tuesday, and emergency alerts have been lifted in several municipalities. Visit Mexico, the National Tourism Board, has not provided updates or guidance for visitors regarding current security issues. And Dr. Peter Tarlow, president of the World Tourism Network, notes that coordination between police departments in different Mexican states is lacking, and he has repeatedly suggested establishing a federal tourism police. Government advisories from the United States, Canada, and Europe stress that Mexico's security risks vary by region, urging travelers to review state-level guidance. Business operations and public transportation in parts of Jalisco have gradually resumed, but officials warn the situation is still unpredictable as security operations continue. Mexico's federal government prioritizes protection in tourist zones, especially ahead of international events, with increased patrols and monitoring in resort areas. travel risk experts say most tourists in major resorts were not targeted in recent unrest, which mainly involved criminal groups and security forces. However, travel can still be indirectly affected by disruptions like highway blockades. Those planning trips in the coming weeks are encouraged to take practical precautions. Monitor your travel advisories for specific Mexican states on your itinerary and allow extra flexibility in travel schedules in case of flight or road disruptions. Avoid unnecessary highway travel in regions that recently experienced blockades and arrange transportation through hotels or reputable operators. Travelers in Mexico should heed local authorities and stay alert and avoid areas with ongoing security operations. While cartel-related disturbances are not uncommon and are usually brief and localized, experts say recent incidents highlight persistent security issues without posing a nationwide threat to tourists. Travel advisors recommend cautious optimism. Mexico remains open, but travelers should be flexible and vigilant. Stay updated via official channels and reliable news sources during rapidly changing situations. So it's a good idea to, 1, enroll in STEP, the Smart Traveler Enrollment Program, a free U.S. Department of State service that allows U.S. citizens traveling or living abroad to enroll their trip with the nearest U.S. embassy to ensure they receive safety updates and emergency alerts. Know the nearest U.S. embassy and how to contact them. You'll also want to know how to call an emergency number in the country you are visiting. 911 is not a universal number. Well, Spirit Airlines has reached a deal with creditors to emerge from bankruptcy as a smaller company, with CEO Dave Davis saying Spirit will become a strong, leaner competitor. The airline has sold aircraft and gates to cut costs and raise cash, and has significantly reduced staff. Spirit will offer 40% fewer flights this summer than they did in 2024. The Travel Technology Association has raised concerns about bills in nearly 20 states that would regulate AI-enabled dynamic pricing, saying the policies would increase operational costs and consumer prices. CEO Laura Chadwick says dynamic pricing is key for the travel industry to manage real-time market conditions, and the impact could be severe. U.S. Travel Association and lawmakers are urging the Trump administration to reinstate the Global Entry program after the Department of Homeland Security suspended it during the partial government shutdown. Suspending this critical security program does the opposite of what the Department of Homeland Security intends, adding volume to standard lines, stretching the very personnel the department is trying to protect, and increasing security risks. U.S. Travel Association Senator Mark Warner of Virginia also stressed the program's importance, noting 18 million travelers used Global Entry in 2025, saving more than 300,000 officer hours. The announcement was issued with extremely short notice to travelers, giving them little time to plan accordingly, which is especially troubling at this time of record air travel. The service was reinstated this week, but it is still a concern as the government is still partially shut down. Now, adults are increasingly opting for resorts and cruises that guarantee a tranquil atmosphere without children, seeking relaxation, romance, and a chance to reconnect with partners or like-minded travelers. This demand has fueled the rise of adult-only sections at properties like Green O at Paws Up in Montana, and inspired policies at hotels such as the Alila Maria Resort in California, which transitioned to adults only in 2025, sparking legal debates about age discrimination. Oceania Cruises recently adopted an 18 and older policy across its fleet, joining established adult-only brands like Viking and Virgin Voyages, which market themselves with cheeky ads highlighting their child-free status. Now, comedian Jim Breuer criticized American Airlines for moving him from his paid first-class seat to make room for a pilot. He says he was reassigned to economy shortly before his Honolulu-Phoenix flight departed and called the move theft and unfair on social media. So why was a paid first-class passenger seat reassigned? Well, Brewer had booked first-class seats for his family on their Hawaii flight, but was moved to row 18 when the airline gave his seat to a pilot. He received no comparable alternative and publicly shared his disappointment. Airlines often transfer pilots and crew to other destinations called deadheading to prepare for future flights. Labor contracts may require crews to sit in premium cabins when available. If first class is full and operational needs demand it, airlines might downgrade passengers to make room for crew. Now, Brewer described his negative experience saying, "This is foul because the way I see it, you, American Airlines, stole from me. You stole my ticket. You stole my money." Airlines like American Airlines rely on repositioning pilots to keep flights on schedule. So if pilots miss their assignment at another airport, it can disrupt rotations and impact many passengers. Crew schedulers must juggle operations, contracts, and service needs, and getting a pilot to the right place on time can help avoid major delays. Involuntary downgrades in premium cabins, where tickets are expensive, are particularly contentious. While the Department of Transportation mandates compensation for certain denied boarding cases, airlines typically address downgrades through fare adjustments or gestures. In Brewer's case, a $500 voucher fell short of his costly ticket, highlighting that premium passengers expect not just seats, but consistent reliability and service. Mishandling such incidents threatens airlines' reputation and high-value clientele. Just $500. I wonder what the difference between an economy seat and a first-class seat was, and if that $500 accounted for that or not. Plus, it should have been that plus the inconvenience of being downgraded. Yeah, I know how it is. You get those expectations. And believe me, they are disappointing when those expectations are not met.
This is Traveling Culturati. We explore cultures and destinations. We share travel news and travel tips to keep you well informed and prepared for your next travel adventure. So go ahead and up your travel game with Traveling Culturati. Visit travelingculturati.com for more information. Welcome back to the Traveling Culturati. I'm your host and travel pro, Javon Harley. Make sure you head on over to the website, travelingculturati.com. Follow us, but also join that travel club. Again, it's travelingculturati.com because we go to some fantastic places with wonderful people, and that's really what it's all about, the people that you meet and the experiences that you have. And our 2026 calendar, I tell you, is fabulous. We have South Africa, we have Ghana, we also have Egypt, France, going to Bordeaux, Cognac, and Paris. We have Fiji, and then later in the year we have Portugal, going to Porto and to Lisbon, and we're currently working on Morocco and Thailand, and those dates will be advised pretty soon. But the ones that I mentioned, they're already on the website, again, travelingculturati.com. Hopefully you can join us on one or more of those trips. It is Black History Month, folks, and while Black history is 24/7, 365, we pay extra tribute and honor in the month of February. And one of the reasons I'm super excited about today is that I get to talk about my hometown. I get to revisit it in every single way that I can. That's Washington, D.C. And what better way to do that than to invite my guest, Kenny Burns, on with me. Kenny is a native Washingtonian, a master storyteller, and one of the city's most respected voices on African American history. For more than 3 decades, Kenny has guided people through Washington, D.C., not just as a tour guide, but as a living bridge between past and present, bringing forward stories that are often overlooked, untold, and misunderstood. Hello, Kenny, and welcome to Traveling Culturati.
Well, hello, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And we've been in contact with each other and we've had experiences for a number of years now. And I have to tell you, folks, Traveling Culturati's travel agency is Advantage International, and we've done several programs in Washington, D.C., and Kenny has been a part of that. So always happy to chat with you, and didn't see you this time, but it's nice to chat with you again.
Well, always a pleasure to speak to a fellow Washingtonian because it's not a whole lot of native born Washingtonians that are still around here in Washington, D.C.
This is very true. And unfortunately, I am in Chicago now, but my roots are in Washington, D.C. I have family members still in Washington, D.C., and I am in Washington, D.C. several times throughout the year. So your hometown never leaves you, no
Uh,
matter
you-
where you go.
As Stephanie Mills says, you can always go home.
This is very, very true. Some of the programs that we've done with you, we've hit some of the major sites, but one of the things that I really love about what you do is we talk about the lesser known, the misunderstood. And one of the things we were talking about before we started the show, because we were talking almost a half an hour before we started
Yeah,
on the show itself, just because when you get a chance to talk to a fellow Washingtonian, you take every opportunity to do that. But we talk about how tightly woven Black history is in Washington, D.C. and in America, but especially Washington, D.C., and that there is no Washington, D.C. without Black history. So it's almost like you can't separate it. You can spotlight it, you can highlight it, but you can't separate it.
and I agree wholeheartedly. Now, let's picture going down Pennsylvania Avenue. That's where the inaugural parade is. There is so much Black history on that one avenue that people don't know about. There's the Navy Memorial. Now, the Navy Memorial sits in between 7th and 9th Street on Pennsylvania Avenue. And some of the Black history of the memorial is during the 1940s, there were very few Black officers in the United States Navy. Eleanor Roosevelt talked to her husband about that. So he instructed the Navy to get some Black officers. So the Navy took 16 enlisted Black men from the enlisted corps and put them in officer candidate school. Now, the Navy chose men who were college graduates, some of them from Howard, high school graduates, some of them from Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., and put them in officer candidate school. Now, for white officers, officer candidate school was 16 weeks. For these Black men, they made it 8 weeks. At the end of the 8 weeks, they gave them a test. All 16 passed the test. The Navy said, my goodness, they must have cheated. Now, let's think about this. They put men who were college graduates and high school graduates in this course. So one would think they would expect them to pass. They said, no, these men must have cheated somehow. Give them another test. So they gave them another test. They scored higher on the second test than what they did the first test. So they made 12 of them officers, one a chief warrant officer, and the other 3 went back into enlisted corps, and that's called the Golden 13. People walk past the Navy Memorial every day, have no idea about that story. FBI building.
This is the importance of the intricacy of the history. But yes, tell us about the FBI building.
This is a story that surprises everybody on my tour. It even surprised me when I heard about it. So the FBI started in 1908. So I always ask people, when do you think the first Black agent started for the FBI? People say 1970, 1980, 2000. The answer is 1919. It was a gentleman named James Wormsley Jones, who had been a captain in the Army in World War I. And being a captain in the Army in World War I is a big deal. So he leaves the Army, becomes a D.C. policeman, and the FBI needed somebody to help them teach their agents how to shoot guns. They gave him the job. The next 3 Black men who were undercover agents, and they were sent in to find out what Marcus Garvey was doing. People walk by the FBI every day. And that's the story that they don't know.
It is astounding. And so I want to go back even maybe a little bit further, because one of the statements that you make is that African American history in Washington, D.C. is not a side narrative, but a central and foundational story of the city itself. So, what is that foundational story for Washington, D.C. and African American history?
Well, African Americans built Washington, D.C. They built the White House, the Capitol, some other buildings. See, back when Washington first started, they had slavery, and people would rent enslaved people out. A lot of times, slave owners couldn't find work for their enslaved people. So, enslaved people, we kind of network. And John would tell Jacob, Jacob would tell Marvin about different jobs. And a lot of times, it was jobs that would build barns, build roads, and the enslaved person would go to their slave owner and say, wow, I can find work on my own. If I give you a portion of whatever I make, can I live in the free African American community and give you a portion of what I make? Slave owner said yes. So that's how Black people would find work on their own, build buildings, build communities. Matter of fact, near Ford's Theater, there was a huge Black African American community of enslaved people and free people living together. We had Berry Farms out in Southeast, which was a huge African American community in the 1860s because the government started it. And getting back to building the White House and the Capitol, 200 enslaved men built the Capitol and the White House. And we also built communities that later on were taken over by other people. But Washington and enslaved people paid not only enslaved people, but free people. There've always been more free people than enslaved people. And how the government got rid of slavery here in Washington, the government bought every enslaved person in Washington, D.C. They paid up to $300 a piece for each person.
The city itself.
The government.
The government, okay.
Yeah, the federal government. And that's the only place in the United States where the federal government paid for enslaved people.
Interesting. I never knew that.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah. But they paid this 300, but not for ownership, but for freedom?
The crazy part about the story, there's a great book called Chocolate City, and it has a whole lot of really great stories in it. So the federal government, led by Abraham Lincoln, is trying to figure out how they can end slavery here in Washington. So they come up with this idea, well, why don't we buy all the enslaved people? And some senators said, well, once we buy them, why don't we send them back to Africa? And other senators said to the other senators, like, you do know they were born here in America. So they had a vote on it. And fortunately, they decided to just set people free. But John, this is the interesting part about this, though, seeing that you grew up here in D.C. So if you lived on Western Avenue or Eastern Avenue or Southern Avenue, and you lived on a plantation, your plantation was divided from D.C. and Maryland. So how would you know if you were living in D.C. or Maryland? You actually had to petition the court, go to court, and you had to plead your case in front of this committee saying that you actually live in D.C., not the Maryland part. And that's how some people got freed.
Yes, and you have to be in Washington to really understand that because it's sandwiched between Virginia and Maryland. And of course, it's why today we call it the DMV because that metropolitan area encompasses that. And those lines have changed along the way, but those lines are there. So that's an excellent, excellent piece of history. But a couple of things you said. Berry Farms. Now, I always thought Berry Farms was named after Marion Barry.
No, Barry's farm, it was a guy named Barry who owned the land. And the government, I think it was the Freedmen's Bureau, wanted to start a place for Black people to live. And the government bought Barry's farms. And then they put Black people there and they sold them the land and the people worked there. A lot of times people who lived in Barry's farms, they worked in the district and they had to work during the day. So at night, Barry's farms was lit up because people were working there, working on their farms or houses. They had their own school system and churches. And unfortunately, they removed quite a lot of Barry's farms because they're building new apartments and stuff over there.
That's one point that I wanted to bring up as well. In the last few years, of course, they demolished what was Berry Farms as far as the housing there, and now there's new development happening. But during Marion Barry's administration, a lot of people did reference it.
It's,
Yes.
it's Barry's Farms.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, no,
exactly.
no, no, no. It goes way back to the
So he just
1800s.
inherited
Yeah,
the
it's like
reference to it.
I,
Yeah.
I I had never heard that. That's cute. Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, this is what people thought, that there was a development of housing that Marion Barry established at some point. Now, maybe at some point he reestablished some housing in that area, but you're talking about the original Barry Farms itself.
Right. The government bought that land and then they put black people on it. And
Yeah.
black people, they bought the land from the government and at a certain price.
Yeah, well, it shows you how stories change over time. And because of ignorance, and I'll raise my hand in that category, you hear things and you don't do your own due diligence as far as looking at following the history. And this is why we have people like you. So thank you for sharing that. But you were mentioning Western, Eastern, and Southern avenues, which run in DC, but also into Maryland. And I think that's why there's so many people, especially in Maryland, not so much in Virginia, but especially in Maryland, still claim to be from DC.
Oh, yeah. I think if you live on the border, and it's interesting to live on the border because I used to live on Eastern Avenue. And I went to one high school, and people right across the street went to high school in DC. And it was interesting that people knew each other, whether you lived in Maryland or DC. And sometimes you would live in Maryland and go to school in DC. So I was at this function and I found out that my wife knew a friend of mine's wife for years. And I never knew that they knew each other because they went to Coolidge. But one person lived in Maryland, but went to school in DC anyway. And it's a difference between living in Maryland and DC. I think when you transition from DC to Maryland, sometimes you have to get used to it because Maryland, they have senators and congressmen and things. In DC, it doesn't. And especially in today's climate, that makes a difference. I've been telling people for years how Washington is controlled by Congress. And they were just like, yeah, 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 yeah. Now they see. And a lot of times people don't understand how Washington is a city and not a state. And it goes way back to right after the Revolutionary War, when soldiers who hadn't been paid for their services during the Revolutionary War, they went to Congress in Philadelphia for their money. And Congress says, well, we're not going to pay you. So these soldiers, they were actually going to have an insurrection. And George Washington, he stands before his men and said, we're not going to do this. It's called the Newburgh Address. Great speech. And he downplays them taking over the government. So in the meantime, Congress gets together and they said, well, we must be able to control the capital city. So in 1790, they instruct George Washington to find a capital for the United States. And they wanted it to be in the South. So George Washington picked this area. One of the reasons why he picked this area was because he knew it was going to take a whole lot of people to build a new city. And he knew that Washington had a huge amount of enslaved people. He also wanted Washington to be a port city. But Congress decided, okay, once we have this city built, we are going to control the city. And that's why Washington is run by Congress and the president.
Well, I can tell you, having lived in Washington, D.C., the taxation without representation has always been the chant and the claim. And on the taxation part, believe me, was one of the highest taxes because we were not a state. And the other thing that's interesting is that if you lived in Washington, D.C. and worked in Maryland or Virginia, you had to pay Maryland and or Virginia taxes because you're using their roads and all of that coming into their states to work. But the same wasn't true for people from Maryland and Virginia. As you mentioned, people lived in Maryland and Virginia, went to school in D.C., or lived and worked in D.C., and they didn't have to pay the taxes. Therefore, our taxes, we had to bear the burden of all of the taxation in Washington, D.C. Therefore, it made our taxes quite high. So I love the foundational part of Black history in Washington, D.C. And I want to retrain myself to just say the history of Washington, D.C., because that's how tightly woven it is. And we can spotlight and highlight, but it is Washington, D.C. history. But when you come to Washington, D.C., and certainly we've had the honor and pleasure of having you as our guide, what are some of the places that are must-sees on that list?
Taking my tour is one of the must-sees, if I can say that. But very seriously, the Frederick Douglass House, the Mary McLeod Bethune House, and the Carter G. Woodson House are all dependent on government funding. On my tour, we take people to the Frederick Douglass House and the Mary McLeod Bethune House. For some reason, the Carter G. Woodson House has been closed for like 2-3 years, and I still haven't quite understood that. But the Frederick Douglass House and the Mary McLeod Bethune House are excellent places to go. The African American Civil War Museum is about to open in the next couple of months. Please visit that.
My husband and I took part in the Civil War Memorial, the African American Civil War
Right.
Memorial. When it was built, we worked on that committee. And so we so proudly were there when they broke ground for it. And that memorial is beautiful as well.
There's two things I want to talk about. I want to talk about Marquette. When Marquette first started, Marquette knew nothing. Marquette is one of the greatest tour guides I know. He'll walk up to you like, well, what state are you from? Well, I'm from Rhode Island. He'll start talking about a black regiment from Rhode Island. Well, what state are you from? Mississippi. He even talks about Confederate soldiers. And to me, that shows you what can happen when we take our young brothers and sisters and work with them. When we sit down there and put some time with them. Everybody that goes past that memorial talks about Marquette. Gotta give my props to him.
He takes you there, and his reenactment, you can see and feel his passion as he portrays and gives you some insight into what it was like for a soldier during that time.
I also want to add, of course, you have the Museum of African American History and Culture.
Yes.
And I want to talk about that a little bit. Excellent museum. I've had people from all across the United States come take my tour because they know that we get them into the museum. And people are so fearful that they're going to close the museum. And I'm thinking, I really hope not. I think every young person of color needs to go to that museum. But this is what I've observed, and I'm quite sure you have a pretty large audience here. School kids come here to Washington in the spring and the summer. It's not kids of color that go to the museum because a lot of times it takes money to come here to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not cheap, but we need to get as many children, kids, teenagers to go to that museum because that museum tells a story and it's full of information, a lot of information. And I just hope that parents, uncles, aunts, whomever can get the kids to come to the museum. So if I were to tell somebody the four must spots, Frederick Douglass, Mary McLeod Bethune House, African American Civil War Memorial, and above all, National Museum of African American History and Culture. Those would be my top four.
I love how the Frederick Douglass home and the National Historic Site is so well preserved. And I've toured, and my groups have toured that site for at least 2 decades now. And it's so well preserved and it has stayed that way. What would you say are the highlights of the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site?
I like the Visitor Center. Now, we must tell people to get up to the Frederick Douglass House, which was finished in 1859. I got to tell you the story about the Frederick Douglass House, how he got the house. So there were people who lived in the Navy Yard, and they did not like living near people of color. So 3 men decided to pull their money together, and they went across the river, the Anacostia River. We call it east of the river. And they bought all this property. And they said, okay, we're not going to sell this property to anybody of color. So basically what they did is they redlined the neighborhood of Anacostia. So it was a gentleman named John Van Hook. He had built this house, started building this house in 1854. He completed it in 1859. So they had bought all this property and they said, well, heck, let's sell this property at a profit. And they did. Things were going good for them until a recession. in the 1870s. Suddenly, people quit buying their property. John Van Hook didn't have enough money to pay the mortgage. The bank foreclosed on his house, and Frederick Douglass bought the house for $6,700 cash. And that's how Frederick Douglass got this house.
Wow. What I love is that the house where it's located, such a bird's eye view of the city, but also that you get a chance to tour inside the home. And it's very important that you have that guided tour because otherwise you don't get the wonderful stories and the history and to learn so much more about Frederick Douglass if you don't do it in that way. Let's talk about Mary McLeod Bethune and the Council House.
Yes, excellent place. She bought that house in the 1940s for $15,000. That house, I'm just guessing, it's got to be over $1.5 million, maybe even $2 million now. And Mary McLeod Bethune started a school on $1.50. I'm trying to figure out how she did that.
That's why she's a great lady.
Yeah. One thing I've learned is that sometimes people put women in the background. And Mary McLeod Bethune was a powerful woman. That movie about the ladies who did the mail.
Yeah, 688.
Thank you. 6888. She started that up with the Tuskegee Airmen. Matter of fact, Eleanor Roosevelt was a good friend of hers. Mary McLeod Bethune went to Eleanor Roosevelt and said, these men need some help. That is why Eleanor Roosevelt hopped in that airplane with that black man of color, and took off, and the Secret Service had a fit. It's like, where'd she go? She's up there. Mary McLeod Bethune was an educator in the president's cabinet, and that house served as a place for the Council of Negro Women. If you go in there, you'll see in that house some of the planning for the March on Washington. She has this chandelier, huge chandelier in there, beautiful. She got it from the White House. They were getting ready to throw it out. She says, I could use that. If you take a tour of the house, you'll see the upstairs bedroom. You also see the offices. It's a great tour. And the Rangers, like I said, some of them from HBCUs like Howard University and Florida A&M, great tour guides. The Mary McLeod Bethune House is on Vermont Avenue, right near Logan Circle. But yeah, and unfortunately, here's another thing that mystifies me. The Bethune House is only open on Thursday, Fridays, and Saturdays. The Frederick Douglass House is only open on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. I always wonder how come some other museums and places are open 7 days a week, and the Carter G. Woodson House isn't open at all yet.
We have to get the word out of the importance and the wonderful history and create the excitement about this history so that we keep these places open and we don't lose these places. There shouldn't be a fear of losing these historical landmarks and these historical places and honoring these historic figures. But if we keep treating them as a side story and narrative and we're putting them in a box, then fewer and fewer people go to see them and visit them because this is why they stay open. They have to be treated as major players in the history of the country and the history of the nation's capital. Kenny, thank you so much for joining me today. You can follow Kenny on YouTube at Tour Guide DC24. You can also reach out to Kenny and hop on one of his tours. And who knows, Traveling Culturati, it may be time for us to do another tour because it's been a few years. But again, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're more than welcome, and thank you for having me.
This is Traveling Culturati. We explore cultures and destinations. We share travel news and travel tips to keep you well informed and prepared for your next travel adventure. So go ahead and up your travel game with Traveling Culturati. Visit travelingculturati.com for more information. Welcome back to the Traveling Culturati. I'm your host and travel pro, Javon Harley. Make sure you check out the website, travelingculturati.com, and follow us on social media. Also want you to join the travel club. We go to some fantastic places and you meet wonderful people along the way. So again, that's travelingculturati.com. I am super excited to have yet another opportunity to chat with Deborah D. Douglas, the author of
Moon, U.S. Civil Rights Trail, and founding director of the Medill Solutions Journalism Hub at Northwestern University, where she also serves as a faculty member. Hello, Deborah, and welcome back to Traveling Culturati.
Thanks for having me, Javon.
Absolutely my pleasure. So I was so excited the first go around, but even more excited the second go around with the U.S. Civil Rights Trail and also travel guide. I think that's super important. How did the official concept evolve?
Well, yeah, it happened outside of me and it happened outside of my publisher. A group of Southern travel bureaus got together and realized that they were telling the story of the Civil Rights Trail in various states and various city and town locations, but there was a more cohesive story that the South had to tell about the mid-century civil rights movement. And I say mid-century because Black people have always fought for civil rights, even before the mid-century movement and even after. The official trail in the South was designated in 2018. And so the first edition of my book, U.S. Civil Rights Trail, was the first book to follow that official trail, the first travel guide that curated basically a Black experience as something as worthy of cultural curation and exploration. It was the first book to do that. And it's done well, and a lot has happened in our culture. And so I've made updates to the first edition, and it's back. And I think probably this experience is back at a time when we need it most.
When you say it is curated well, that is an understatement. It's a piece of history. It's a guide. It gives backstories, relevance, significance to all of these different areas. So absolutely, that's an understatement for you to say that it was so well curated. What gap did your book fill as the first guide? And then how was that expanded on the second?
Well, a lot of times when you look at travel shows, or if you look at travel books, or even if you reach out to a city that you might have interest in and you ask for information from the local travel authorities, you're not necessarily pointed in the direction of Black communities or Black neighborhoods. So it was important that I, as an African-American woman, someone whose history, personal family history is grounded in this story, it was important that I act of the story, because very often we don't get commissioned to tell our own stories. And we are experts on our own lived experience. And so that was really important to me to be able to do this. It's also important that Black communities are considered worthy of cultural curation. So I don't know about you, Javon, but over the years of traveling, very often I'll reach out via email, or I may go to a travel office, whether or not it's domestic travel or international travel. And I'll ask for information and maps and anything that might help me determine my path once I arrive at my destination. And very often I have not seen Black communities as a place where travelers are deliberately pointed to go to engage, to explore, to learn about, to even engage in commerce. And so it was really important for me to let the world know that the places where we live and thrive are wonderful places to visit, wonderful places to learn, and wonderful places to turn your dollar over. Because in this guide, I prioritize Black-owned businesses whenever I can, wherever I can, because I think the greatest tribute to the story of the mid-century civil rights movement is to invest in the story and invest in the people and invest in what the story meant for all of us in terms of becoming fully enfranchised and achieving the highest potential that being a part of this country represents.
Well, it certainly is. You're absolutely right. I recently went to a holiday function put on by a destination. It was Newport in Providence, Rhode Island. And I'm currently reading the book, The Davenports, and also I became very engaged in the Gilded Age series, and so many references to Providence, Rhode Island. And the young lady that I was sitting next to had no idea what I was talking about. And afterwards, she connected with me and she said, you know what? We have a Black History Trail here, and I didn't know that we did. So you're absolutely right. It's just such a missing piece of travel and tourism puzzle. Yet it's such an intricate piece, and one that it's amazing that it's not really being told in the capacity or totality of how it should be, which is why your book, The U.S. Civil Rights Trail, is so important, and that it acts as a travel guide as well. In the process, what was the most surprising story or even detail that you uncovered while researching the trail?
Well, there is an historic image of a young man, a teenager, in the Selma to Montgomery March, taken by a couple of photographers. He is dark skinned and lanky, and he has the word vote etched in his forehead in some kind of white substance. And so I tried to identify that young man and then find him to see if he was still around so I could interview him. I actually wanted to take a picture of him at the age that he is now. It turned out that person was and is Bobby Simmons, and he was a teenager from Selma. And so I got to tell the story of the aftermath of Bobby Simmons being at the Selma to Montgomery March. And I asked him, well, why did you etch vote in your forehead in a white substance? And what is that substance? And he said that it was sunscreen. And I said, sunscreen? Sunscreen on a Black person in the 60s? I said, where'd you get sunscreen? Because, we weren't really doing that at that particular point in Black history, even though we now know that sunscreen is important for us now. I've written about it for O Magazine. He said, oh, a white girl gave it to me. So it was so funny because it just showed how the multicultural, the multiracial energy behind that momentous occasion. Of course, Black people have always freed themselves, and they were doing it then. And the Selma to Montgomery March happened because Black people persisted, but it was a multiracial effort, and people of all backgrounds came to Selma to support that march. And the fact that he was in community and fellowship in that way on that march, and that's how he got that iconic symbol etched in his head, was just so eye-opening for me.
That's such an interesting story and so unexpected, but it is a wonderful story. Now, you also mentioned finding and mentioning Black-owned businesses as much as you possibly can, and you mentioned commerce. So how does this physical journey connect to the broader idea of Black investment and returns in America?
I mean, I think pretty much everyone is familiar with the idea that when Dr. King was assassinated, his message was one of economic empowerment, and that the perception is that the powers that be didn't really want him to make those connections, not just for Black people, but for everyone. Because if we realize how much we had in common and how much our economic possibilities were linked in a common experience, powerful things could happen. And so part of being able to live and thrive is to be able to have economic empowerment and to be self-determining in terms of having your own businesses and being able to take care of your family and your community. And so at the very least, if I'm creating or crafting an experience for you in every city that I focus on in this book, and I'm telling you where to go sleep and where to go eat or where to shop, the least I could do is point you in the direction of Black-owned businesses, because investing in those businesses, investing in the idea of Black empowerment is a continuation and a tribute to this movement.
You're so right. I think it's been in the last 10 years that I learned about Dr. King's shift in his speeches and concerns and his focal point and his agenda. And prior to that, we just kept hearing the same phrases over and over again. And so when I learned that, I just kind of felt like, why didn't I know that? Because you also mentioned at one point about feeling undereducated and unprepared while researching. So how did that experience in experiencing the trail shift your perspective on risk and activism?
Yeah, well, just on that point about ideas that Dr. King and other activists had at that time, everybody's talking about universal basic income now. Well, Dr. King talked about that in the 60s. So, I mean, they say there's no idea under the sun. A lot of times ideas get buried, especially when there's power and possibility behind those ideas. And so my eyes are open in that way. When I talked about being undereducated, I meant that as I've been traveling on this journey for the first edition and the second edition, I've interfaced with these places over and over again. I realized how educated the activists were, just local people were. They had multiple degrees, they had families, they had homes, they raised families. They were just so fully actualized as human beings. And then they had the courage to put their lives on the line, to put their bodies on the line, to put their children's bodies on the line, to secure rights that they were due, and to carve a path for me to be able to just sit here at my desk asking myself, like, what do I want to do today? Or what do I want to manifest in the world? That's a privilege to be able to do that. And so I feel like under accomplished in that way, that these people went for the gusto, and working together, they caused this big, beautiful cataclysm of impact to occur. And of course, there are efforts to diminish the impact and diminish the power and deconstruct and destroy that progress. But we have a blueprint for how it was done before. And this is a travel experience and a lifestyle experience, but it's also a blueprint for activism, because we've been gifted with a guide on how to affect change in a massive way.
The U.S. Civil Rights Trail, fully revised and updated. I'm telling you, this is such a beautifully curated book and guide. It hits so many different aspects of history, education, travel, so many wonderful nuances. Deborah, I can't thank you enough for joining me again today and for your work.
Thank you so much, Devon. I really appreciate you.
Ladies and gentlemen.
This is Traveling Culturati. We explore cultures and destinations. We share travel news and travel tips to keep you well informed and prepared for your next travel adventure. So go ahead and up your travel game with Traveling Culturati. Visit travelingculturati.com for more information.